What's up, college football addicts? I know people like to toss around the word bombshell pretty lightly, and I know at times I've even been guilty of it. But trust me, you're going to want to stick around today. We have a jam-packed episode for you guys, and we're going to dive into at least one new team who is in secret talks with the Big Ten. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about Clemson. I'm not talking about FSU or North Carolina. I'm going to talk about the main driver pushing this team to have such a massive change of heart. I'm also going to talk about what this means for Clemson and Florida State. And then I'm going to let you guys in on a massive surprise that could completely turn conference realignment on its head, because there is another surprise team involved in all of this that is not directly involved in these negotiations. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you who it is. Notre Dame is very tangled up in this entire puzzle, but not for the reasons that you probably think. And just to be clear, no, they are not the new team involved in talks to join the Big Ten, but they are very much involved. And today, I'm going to tell you why. But before we get started, thank you very much for joining me. I'm happy to have you. Take a quick moment and subscribe if you enjoy our conference realignment coverage. You may agree with some things. You may disagree with some things. I do appreciate you being here. You can show that appreciation back by just clicking that subscribe button. Now, I've said before here on College Football Addiction, I want you to know that I try to be crystal clear with you. I try to differentiate between just fun speculation, fair possibilities, good possibilities, or possibilities that are highly likely. Today, in my opinion, I am reporting that this prediction has a very fair possibility. I'd estimate it somewhere between 25 and 50% chance of happening, which I know doesn't necessarily sound like great odds, but it is absolutely mind-blowing considering what I'm going to tell you. So as always, invite you to listen to the evidence and then come to your own conclusions. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, your predictions down there. I'm okay if you disagree. Just let me make my case and then go ahead. So before you can get to the team talking to the Big Ten, you first need to understand the massive changes that caused this landslide. And if you're going to do that, you're going to want to pay attention because this stuff is critical to understanding what's going on. A few days ago, Ross Dellinger of Yahoo Sports reported that a settlement is shaping up to pay college players. This settlement, also known as revenue sharing with players, costs an estimated $30 million per year and is expected to start either in 2025 or the 2026 season. So remember that $30 million. I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. Now I'm going to talk about the average football coaching salaries in the ACC, which is consistently rising annually. Coaching salaries can vary massively depending on the team, but to keep things simple, we're going to go with a rough average estimate of around $17 million per team. Now, teams like Florida State and Clemson would be significantly over this amount, while teams like Wake Forest and BC would be a little bit under it. The number doesn't include any team expenses like travel, hotel stay, meals, and nutrition. So when you add in that $30 million I told you guys to remember earlier, and the 17 for coaching, and then all of the travel and meals and hotels and nutrition, you're talking about well above $50 million per team. And that's just to be able to compete at the bare minimum level of the sport within Power 2. And there's an absolutely epic and terrifying hair on fire with that $50 million plus amount. And that is that the ACC is only paying out $40 to $42 million a year currently. Their annual payout is increasing much slower than the inflation on all other expenses, which leaves at a minimum an $8 to $10 million deficit. And that just to be able to compete at the bare minimum level of the sport within the Power 2. Now, I'm going to repeat that for you. For those of you in the back, a team in the ACC competing at the highest level is going to operate in a massive deficit from what the conference is actually paying them. And this is before calculating the massive loss of revenue from losing Florida State, Clemson, and others. Now, so some of you guys I know are asking, what does any of this have to do with the new team who is talking to the Big Ten? Well, I'm glad you asked. I'm going to get to it in just a moment. But the important takeaway here is there is no such thing as the Power Four. After revenue sharing gets here, there truly only will be the Power Two. Now, if you're a fan of one of those teams in the Big 12 and the ACC being locked out, you're going to want to stick around because I do have some good news coming up for you shortly. But of all of the attacks currently going against the ACC, none would be bigger than if one of the teams they recently signed turned against them. And we are learning that that's exactly what Stanford might be doing to the ACC. The Cardinal have opened up backdoor communications with the Big 10. Now, supposedly, this is in an effort to see if they could negotiate a landing spot in the Power 2. And as I discussed earlier, the financial logic for getting out of the ACC deal by far makes the most sense. But first, remember what Stanford did to get into the ACC. They took a 30% share in the first 7 years, followed by a 70% share in year 8 and 75% in year 9, before finally getting the full payout in year 10. So that's already a huge discount if things went perfectly and completely as planned. But that's not what's going to happen. The deal was made assuming the ACC would still be being paid its full amount from ESPN until 2036. But if you're following these ACC court cases, this is looking less and less likely by the day. And I've already told you guys, ESPN is not planning to extend the ACC network contract in 2027. In fact, the more that comes out of these court cases, the more Stanford's lawyers are starting to realize how screwed the ACC truly is. But if that's not bad, what's next is even worse. Because remember, the $50 million that we talked about earlier, the total revenue sharing with players and coaches' salaries and more, Stanford is coming to realize that if they stay in the ACC after Clemson and FSU escape, they will likely be making a fraction of what the ACC currently is. So instead of the $8 to $10 million annual shortfall, which is basically guaranteed if everything goes as well as it can for the ACC, they are a lot more likely to be seeing a $30 to $40 million annual shortfall after the Seminoles and Tigers leave. And at that point, why not just make the Big 10 an offer it can't refuse? Even something like 10 years at 25% payout and then a permanently reduced 50% payout after that puts Stanford in a much stronger position than they would be in if they were in the ACC. And I know that sounds crazy, but these are real scenarios being discussed behind the scenes. It's a win-win for all involved. The Big 10 makes a ton more money, and Stanford does too. Stanford has the bank accounts and the endowments to pull this off pretty easily. It only takes one big-time donor to completely close that gap. Now, let me be clear. I don't know all the details of how this could play out. I don't think anyone really does because there are just too many moving pieces. So I don't know if Stanford has some kind of get out of their contract before it finalizes, or if the contract Stanford signs has as many holes as the other teams like Clemson and Florida State did. But I'm pretty sure that when the ACC implodes because Florida State and Clemson blows holes in it, or if ESPN pulls the rug out from underneath the ACC, as they've already told the ACC they plan to do, then Stanford will easily be able to escape at no cost. Because I think that this is highly likely that the ACC lied to manipulate all three of the recent teams who joined. They intentionally did not tell them the truth about the future of the conference and ESPN's unilateral ability to end that network deal. So it would be completely fitting for those teams to throw up the deuces and to set fire to the ACC as they left. And Notre Dame fans, I've not forgotten about you. We're going to get to how you guys play into this shortly. But now that you understand who is in talks with the Big 10, there is something even more critically important to understand when it comes to the teams outside of the Power 2. Miami fans, SMU fans, NC State fans, and all you other borderline teams need to listen to this closely. I know a lot of people who heard the news about Stanford earlier and thought that we were crazy And I know that there is no way that the Big Ten would ever take a team that is so worthless to add to their network agreement, because adding Stanford would definitely not add value to the TV contract, but instead it would cost the existing teams more out of their share. But remember what I told you a few months ago, because I think we were one of the first to tell you the Big Ten and the SEC adding teams at permanently reduced shares was not only plausible, but it was almost a certainty. And it would work just fine with a look-in provision that allowed for market adjustments, so that if those teams ever raised themselves up in value and became worth the full amount, they would be able to receive it. So let's run through how all of this works, because Stanford isn't the only team who this works out for. In fact, I'd argue that there are several teams in the ACC and the Big 12 with bank accounts and rich enough boosters to pull this off. And it actually makes these teams tons more money than they would otherwise get in the ACC and the Big 12. Basically, the ACC and the Big 12 are roughly going to get paid about half as much as the SEC and the Big 10. Any team that adds more than 50% of the full share value to the SEC and the Big 10 would likely be better off in the Power 2. And if you're willing to commit to spending the league minimum on football and basketball to stay competitive, and if you're willing to have an NIL organization that keeps you competitive, and if you have a fan base that's willing to donate enough for you to operate at a deficit, then there are going to be financial ways to get into the SEC and the Big 10. Just like with SMU and Cal and Stanford taking a massive discount to get into the ACC. If they're willing to do that for the ACC, why wouldn't these teams be willing to go 10 to 15 years with no payout to join the SEC and the Big 10? And why wouldn't they be willing to tap into their massive endowments? Never underestimate the fact that if there is a financial will, there is a financial way. Let's talk about what this new information means for Clemson and Florida State. The way that I see it is, with this bombshell news coming out, there are basically three massive implications to this fallout. The first massive implication is the settlement amount. And I can tell you the settlement amount is lowering by the day, because every time the risk of the ACC imploding increases, that settlement amount becomes less and less. The next massive implication is a new alliance being formed, with Clemson and Florida State and Stanford potentially finding themselves together in a new conference. The tables would be completely turned on the adversarial approach that we've seen between these teams recently. In fact, you'd start seeing them help each other. You could see Clemson and FSU helping Stanford get out of their agreement to join the ACC. You could see Stanford helping Clemson and FSU with their goal to escape the conference. Literally anything would be on the table. The last massive implication is how much travel it could cut off from Clemson and FSU having to travel out to California. Adding Stanford would get USC and Oregon a closer regional opponent to play every year. This could significantly save every team involved a ton of travel expenses, and perhaps even add an extra year in between having to travel out there so much, which ultimately benefits everyone. Now, finally, shout out to the Notre Dame fans. I know a lot of you guys don't like them, but they have been waiting patiently, so we'll give them some love. Let's talk about how this impacts you guys. First, Notre Dame's biggest all-time rivalry. If you ask any Notre Dame fan who their top 5 biggest rivals, they're going to tell you something like USC, Michigan State, Stanford, Michigan, and Purdue. And their order may be different. They might even include Navy somewhere in that top 5. But for the most part, you better believe that their list is going to be very similar. Well, if Stanford joined, which conference would all those teams be a member of? That's right. Those are all Big 10 teams. And if that conference were to implement a Big 10 conference schedule, who would Notre Dame have left to play? My point is that landing Stanford basically is another layer completely sealing off the deal with Notre Dame and bringing them home to the Big 10 where they belong. Let's not forget, Notre Dame was instrumental in fighting to secure Stanford safe passage into the ACC. Notre Dame has had Stanford's back this entire time. And there are tons of political connections between the two teams and tons of history between the two programs. So long story short, I think it's becoming abundantly clear that Notre Dame's future is going to be in the Big 10. And this may not happen in the next year or two because of the timing with the college football playoff expansion. And eventually, though, all the cards will be laid on the table and hands will be forced. And there are just too many connections between Notre Dame and the Big Ten, so the choice is going to be very clear. Now that you understand just how horrible the situation is with the ACC, looking to have another team that may join Florida State and Clemson, you're missing something. There's a problem. And that's what's critically important for the league's future. Another part of that deals with the epic win that Clemson just recently got in court versus the ACC. If you missed that win, click the video on the screen now to check it out.